Today we're going to go over Module 12, Section 3, Type 1 and Type 2 errors. Please pause the video as you feel necessary to complete your notes that I linked to on courtmath.com. So there are two types of possible errors that we can make when we're doing hypothesis testing. The first is a Type 1 error. And a Type 1 error is only possible if we reject the null hypothesis. It is an error because the null is actually true. So what this means is due to the randomness of sampling, our sample provided evidence that appeared to support the alternative, but the null is actually true. A type 2 error begins when we fail to reject the null hypothesis. So a type 2 error can only be made if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, but it's an error because the null is false. So that means that our sample actually showed that we do not have strong evidence to reject the null, but the null is false. Now, it's important to know that a type 1 and type 2 are not caused by mistakes. They are the results of random chance. We have random sampling to get a sample set of statistics, and that can sometimes create extreme values. So the data provided evidence for a conclusion, but that conclusion is false. It's no one's fault. It's just due to the randomness of sampling. Now, next. What can go wrong? So here's a table of the possible outcomes. We can reject the null hypothesis, which means we have strong evidence for the alternative. HO is true. HO is false. Well, if we reject the null hypothesis and accept HO, the alternative, HO is true, that means we made a type 1 error. However, if HO is false, then we made no mistake. So just because we reject the null hypothesis does not mean we made a mistake. It is just a potential, it just provides potential for a type 1 error. If we fail to reject HO, that means we do not have enough evidence to accept the alternative, and HO is true, then we made no mistake. However, if we fail to reject HO and HO is false, that means our evidence was not strong enough, then, that means we made a type 2 error. Alright, so example 1. Food inspectors inspect samples of food to see if they are safe. This can be thought of as a hypothesis test with the following hypotheses. The food is safe, the food is not safe. Identify a type 1 error and state the consequences. A type 1 error would mean we reject the null hypothesis, but we should not have. So for rejecting the null hypothesis, notice that means we think HA is true. If we think HA is true, we think the food is not safe. So let's write that in context. We think the food is not safe. Our sample made us think the food was not safe, but it's an error. So the food is actually safe. So it's very important that you understand that an error was made if we're talking about a type 1 error. We want to consider what that error suggests. If we look at consequences, there's a lot of consequences. So I'm just going to give you two. Maybe you can think of other ones. If we think the food is not safe, the food will be recalled when it did not need to be recalled. That means the manufacturer of the food will lose lots of money. Another consequence you could give is that we waste food. It is thrown away when it's actually okay to eat. We fail to reject the null, but should have rejected the null. That means we are thinking that HO is true. So we failed to reject the null. That means we're going to think HO is true. So the consequences of that error, in context, let's explain what that means. We failed to reject the null, but should not have rejected the null. Our sample makes us think the food was safe, but the fact the food is actually not safe. So remember, this is an error. We think HO is true, but HO is actually not true. In a type 1 error, we reject the null. We think HA is true, but it is actually not true. So let's think of some consequences of a type 2 error. Consequences: the food will not be recalled, people will get sick, the company should get sued, and their brand could be tarnished. Let's look at another example. Example 2. A medical researcher claims that no more than 4% of its users will experience harmful side effects. This example does not give us the hypothesis, so we should write the hypothesis before we continue. HO is that P equals 0.04. That means no more than 4% of users will experience harmful side effects. Let's set that as our null. HA, what we're going to test for is to see if more than 4% of users will experience harmful side effects. That should be our experiment because it has some consequences if more than 4% of users are experiencing harmful side effects. So, a type 1 error starts off with us rejecting the null, but we should not have. Okay? So that means we're rejecting the null. We think HA is true, but we're wrong. Our sample provides us evidence that more than 4% of users experience harmful side effects, but if the drug were sold, no more than 4% of users would experience those effects. Let's think of some consequences of this. So if we're thinking that the drug is harmful, but it's not harmful, what will happen in the long run? If we think the drug is harmful, the drug probably won't be sold or approved by the FDA due to evidence showing harmful side effects. So if it's not being sold, the drug company loses money, people will think it's harmful, and it never makes it to the market. Other consequences you can think of are that people will miss out on a drug that was working for them, or people will be scared of a drug that could actually help them. Let's look at a type 2 error. A type 2 error means we failed to reject the null, but should not have rejected the null. Our sample did not provide us with enough evidence to show that the drug was harmful, but the drug will actually cause harmful side effects in more than 4% of the people. So if we fail to reject the null, we're not going to think the drug is harmful, but it actually is. So it's very important. If we fail to reject the null, we're thinking it is not harmful. So, what are some consequences of this type of thinking? Consequences. Well, if we think the drug is not harmful, it will probably be sold, but people will experience harmful side effects, and that could result in death. The company opens itself to lawsuits for not advertising the true side effects of the drug, and they could go out of business. So again, there's other consequences you can think of. I'm just giving you an example of a few.